So first of all, welcome to this seminar, Dialogue on Philosophy and Technology. My name is Yuk Hui, and so this is our 7th seminar on this in this series. So I want to welcome everyone and thank you for coming. Especially people from different, very different time zones. So it's my great pleasure today to welcome Andrew Feenberg, who is going to give us a seminar and follow with a dialogue, and then also Q&A afterwards. Andrew Feenberg, I think I don't need to introduce much about him because he's one of the most influential philosophers working on technology today. In his early years, he studied at the UC San Diego under Herbert Marcuse, and he was also active like Marcuse in the 60s during the student movement, and in the past decades he has been teaching at the School of Communication at the Fraser University until recently he became Professor Emeritus. And when he was at the School of Communication at the Fraser University, he also directed the Applied Communication and Technology Lab. Between 2013 and 2019, he served as a Directeur de Programme at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. And it's also because of that I had occasion to meet Andrew several summers in Paris. His books include Questioning Technology, Transforming Technology, Heidegger and Marcuse, Between Reason and Experience, The Philosophy of Praxis, and Technosystem, The Social Life of Reason. His forthcoming book on Marcuse will appear with Verso this year. And today he's going to give a seminar with the title Meaning and Existence, with reference to Marcuse, to Rousseau, and to Nishida. So I will end my brief introduction here, and I would like to welcome Andrew Feenberg. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay, I think I'm on. I'm going to go to screen sharing now so I can show you the slides as I talk. Let's see if I can do this. I think, okay. Now, can everyone see the screen? Can you see the screen, Yuk?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay, good. So you've got there the title of the talk. Let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do. So this is a talk based on a new book I've written about Marcuse. The book considers, it treats of many different aspects of Marcuse's thought, but the central theme has to do with the relation of science and culture. And this was an important subject for Marcuse, especially you may have read One-Dimensional Man, and there's a lot of discussion of science and how it needs to be transformed in that book. So I'm going to treat this at a very fundamental level in terms of the relation of lived meanings to factual existence. If we think of culture as carrying the meanings that we live and experience in our daily life, and contrast that with the data of science, the factual existences that science recognizes, we can reconstruct the dilemma that Marcuse was concerned with in One-Dimensional Man. And I'm going to bring in phenomenology and also the Japanese philosopher Nishida in order to develop the concepts. So we'll start with some abstract concepts in phenomenology and Nishida and move from there with Marcuse to social consequences. There's a relevance to ecology in what I'll be saying. It'll show up at the very end, but it's not a talk about in ecology, the environment. We have to get there first, and that requires some heavy conceptual lifting. So let's begin with factual existence. This is objective reality for common sense, at least modern common sense. And according to this view of the world, things are independent of the subject, they're separate from each other, and they're self-contained. And these separate and self-contained things relate to each other causally. Their interactions are causal. And according to this common sense view, human beings are also things. And so their actions too, their actions on the world of things are causal interactions too. Now, I call this a third person standpoint of knowledge. It's a third person because the subject of knowledge is not the I, me, but the one, as in one knows. In French, you would say on sait, man in German. The one is the universal subject that is implied in any kind of knowledge. It's an impersonal subject. If you entered this room, you would see the same things I see. So it's not personal to me that there's a chair here or a table there. And this impersonality is an epistemic ideal, which is taken up by science. There's a kind of ascesis or discipline of science by which objectivity is obtained from the perceptions and the thoughts of individual subjects. And the result then are those scientific articles in which the I never appears, only propositions. So the question then that this lecture poses is, how do we relate meaning and culture to this notion of knowledge, this third person ideal of knowledge? Culture poses a problem for this view of knowledge. Meaning is inherent in perception and action. We're aware of this. The empiricists talked about sense data, blobs of color and shape, but that's silly. In reality, we perceive things as meaningful immediately. We don't need to add something to what we perceive. It's there already. So when you perceive a chair, a table, a book, you don't see a blob of sensations. You see a chair, a table, and a book. And these terms, chair, table, and book, are meanings. They're cultural facts, you could say, but they are not like factual existence, not like the things that common sense calls facts, because culture necessarily implies a subject. And here we have a strangeness about modern consciousness, because we are both in this third person view of the world and also aware, ever since Kant anyway, that the mind contributes somehow to that third person view by supplying the meanings of the things that are perceived. But once you introduce meaning, culture, which is of course the sum of or the source of meaning, once you introduce culture, you're stuck with a subject. You can't abstract from the subject anymore. But in fact, of course, that's what objective study of culture does. Sociologists, anthropologists, linguists, they all talk about meaning as though meanings were things in the world. And yet we know that the subject is involved. Without recognition, there is no meaning. So our objective way of trying to squeeze culture and meaning into our conception of thinghood falsifies the living truth of culture. And in order to get at that truth, Husserl, the German philosopher Edmund Husserl, invented phenomenology. Phenomenology is a method for recovering the subject, understanding lived experience. In order to get at lived experience, you need to, Husserl says, suspend the natural attitude. By this, he means that instead of viewing things as factual existences, as I've just described, you think of them as they appear to consciousness. And as they appear to consciousness involves stuff that isn't normally considered factually pertinent, like feelings, aesthetic qualities, potentialities. So suspending the natural attitude reveals the stuff that's in your head, so to speak, although Husserl wouldn't actually put it that way, all of it, and not just the part which can be shared with everyone because it is part of the data of factual experience. Well, Husserl was, of course, aware of these, the richness of consciousness and all the various things that flow through it, but he was really interested in universal structures of experience. He believed that just as there are universal structures natural science can detect in the world of facts, there are also universal structures of consciousness that we can identify in our experience. So let me give you an example. Take lived time and space as examples. The space of Euclid is a uniform space viewed from outside that space, but the space that we live in, that we experience in our daily life, is a space in which we are situated. And this has all kinds of consequences. For example, a universal feature of our lived space is near and far. Things are near and far, but that's only conceivable because we're in the space. We have to be in the space for something to be near us or to be far from us. And it's furthermore, there are qualities of lived time and space that are different from the Euclidean ones. For example, things have a different urgency about them when they are coming toward us than when they are going away. This is especially noticeable when you're on the soccer field with the ball. We could also make the same observation about time. Time, as measured by clocks, belongs to the world of factual existence, but the time of everyday experience moves faster and slower depending on what's going on. And those are not qualities that you find in the world of facts, but they're definitely an important aspect of a lived experience. Okay, well, among the universals of consciousness, there is also meaning. Meanings must be recognized by a subject to exist. They are lived. And our lived experience of these meanings turns out to be far more complex than you might think at first. These lived meanings are, first of all, perceptual. So let's consider the perceptual aspect of the lived meanings, say, of the living room in which I'm sitting. There are books here, there are rugs on the floor, there are sofas. I perceive all these things. Of course, I can think of them as factual existences, as simple objects, but I also, and as such, I would be in a causal relation to them, and they would be causally related to each other, but they're also implicated in each other in a very different way. The sofas, for example, are positioned so that people who sit on them can talk to each other. That's a feature of the that is immediately evident to me when I perceive the sofas. The rugs have aesthetic qualities, which again, I immediately perceive. And these aesthetic qualities are related to the fabrics on the sofas and the pictures on the wall and so on. All of these implicated relations are non-causal. They're relations of meaning. So Husserl argued that you could understand this in terms of the concept of life world. The everyday world as it is lived forms a kind of whole. It's a whole with fringes on the edges, because of course you can always move from any given aspect of it to another. But within the life world, there is a system of references that holds the objects together. So I've given you the example of the interior space, which of course you could multiply with any other kind of space in which you are located. I want to give you another example that I think makes it clear what I mean by the implication of the objects as they are lived in the life world. And I'll give you the example of chess. Let's take a bunch of chess pieces. These are factual existences. They can be moved around. They bump against each other in a box. They have an origin in a factory, and so on. So from the standpoint of factual knowledge, the chess pieces are self-evidently involved in causal relations. But they're also chess pieces, which means that they have relations that are established by the rules of the game. And those relations implicate each piece in the others. They form a whole. So this is more fundamental, according to Husserl, because this is the level at which we're operating consciously in our everyday experience. Of course, there are no rules in the sense in which chess has rules, but there are implicated relations of all sorts that guide us through the world, the life world. Now, according to phenomenology, these relations of meaning are the source of the objective meanings that we can formulate in language and talk about in sociology. We abstract from the lived individual meanings in discourse in order to construct these objective quasi-factual forms of meaning. This is the constitution of the facts, because all the facts of factual existence have their origin in the life world and in the meanings that are carried by our consciousness in the life world. So we can see that lived experience is the source of facts. It has to be refined into objects of knowledge in order to reach that third-person view that I talked about. The facts are constructed from the sort of what you might think of as the plenum, the manifold of the life world. And the sciences, as we'll see toward the end of this talk, have specific objects constructed from the life world that are their specific objects. By this I mean that sciences don't treat the entire world all at once. They treat a little portion of it. Physics, for example, treats matter in motion. Biology treats life, and so on. Each science has to construct that fraction of the total world that it wants to deal with and that it can understand. And so this is the form in which science relates to the life world through object constructions. Okay, now I'm going to move here to Nishida. Kitara Nishida was a Japanese philosopher. He encountered Western science in Japan in the early 20th century, and this shaped his whole understanding of philosophy. Japan was undergoing a radical technical change in the early 20th century. Western science was introduced, and it was accepted for the most part as a universal form of knowledge, and superior in many ways to the existing Japanese forms of knowledge. At the same time, Western science was clearly a particular culture. It came from the West. So although it had this pretension to universality, it also was somehow bound up with a specific culture, quite different from the culture of Japan and the East. So here then, when we think about the relation of factual knowledge to meaning in this context, in this Japanese context, we're moving to a very different standpoint from that of Husserl and phenomenology. Instead of the although we'll continue with the notion of lived experience from phenomenology, we're now dealing with a historical encounter between facts and meanings, between lived experience and culture on the one hand and science on the other. And the problem for Japanese philosophers in the early 20th century was to somehow integrate science, that is to say knowledge, this new knowledge, to culture, the world of human activity. And Nishida specifically tried to save Japanese culture from dissolution into this Western science. Now, his thought was influenced by Western philosophy. He was up to date on everything happening in Germany, and he read William James and Hegel. He introduced into this philosophical mass some Eastern elements, specifically Buddhism, which he practiced in his personal life. And he was engaged in a kind of synthetic effort to somehow build out of Western philosophy and Buddhism a synthesis that would accommodate Western science to Japanese culture. And he did this by constructing a dialectic. It's a series of stages. He called them fields or places of being. Each stage in his dialectic depends on a higher stage from which it abstracts. So you could think of this as a series of enlarging contexts. You start with the lowest context, the most impoverished, which is factual existence, just as I've described it. But factual existence presupposes the individuality of the subject that knows the facts. So you move to the stage of individuality. And from there, you need to move to the stage of culture, because the individual is not just a knower, but also a human person embedded in a historical situation. So you can see that the contexts of the dialectic correspond to Western knowledge and Eastern culture. Now, there is a final stage inspired by the Mahayana Buddhist doctrine, which I'm going to have to admit, it's very complicated and would require a whole other lecture to explain it. Even then, I wouldn't be sure I got it right. But these first stages of the dialectic are pertinent to my subject. So let me go through them in more detail. First of all, there's knowledge. This is the level of judgment, objectivity. It works by attributing predicates, that is to say, universals, to things. So I have a red book. Red is the predicate of the book, which is the thing, and red is a universal concept. In order to construct knowledge, we simply accumulate predicates to individual things and make judgments about the nature of those things in this way. But Nishida points out, in doing so, we've abstracted from the knower. We're not in the propositions that we generate through our judgments are independent. They appear independent of the knower who creates them. But that's an abstraction, because of course, without a knower, there is no known. There's a necessary correlation between subject and object. So Nishida then argues that we must pass from the stage of judgment to the stage of the individual, the knower. The individual knower is itself an individual thing. Only an individual can relate to another individual. So we have to now conceive the knower as a person, as Nishida says, a self-consciousness. And this self-consciousness, Nishida wants to understand in the first person. So you have to be careful. He does not see the knower as a thing in the world. He sees the knower as in more or less phenomenological terms, as a first person engaged consciously with the known reality. So far, we've managed to connect judgment to the subject of knowledge, but Nishida points out that the subject of knowledge is not just a subject of knowledge. The subject of knowledge must exist in a historical world. It must belong to a culture. So the subject of knowledge, that pure I which knows, is also contextualized by the culture that forms it and that generates for it the meanings that it attributes, those predicates that it attributes to objects. So now we move to the third stage, the stage of culture. The individual, as a human being, is an acting being. As such, it belongs to a culture which designates meanings and values. It lives those meanings and values through its actions. And so you can find here in culture the ground of individual life and therefore also of knowledge. Now, here's something that's going on that's puzzling, because as lived, culture is experienced as necessary. We have a very clear sense that when we get things right, they fit together because they belong together. There's a kind of flow to the experience of action, and we're gratified when that flow is smooth and the gestures that we perform, the acts that we perform, coincide with the meaning of the things that we're engaged with. So this is something that's self-evident in lived experience. But from the standpoint of knowledge, our starting point, judgment, culture is completely arbitrary. There could be an infinite number of cultures, and we happen to be situated in one of them, but it has no privilege over the others. So this is the puzzle, the conundrum that Nishida ends up in, and which I don't think he has a satisfactory solution for. I call this the conundrum of knowledge and action. So in order to understand this better, I'm going to leave Nishida behind and offer my own suggestions for how to make sense of this relationship between knowledge and action. Action is meaningful in itself, apart from its relation to the world. Every act has a meaning. For example, if you raise your hand, you've raised your hand and people will recognize that. And if it's in a classroom, they'll recognize you and say, yes, what do you have to say? So the actions are, you can think of actions as gestures which have a meaning, but they're also, these actions are also related to meanings in the world. So we can't really understand how to act toward an object, the meaning of which is unclear to us. So acts and objects of action correlate, and they're both endowed with tacit meaning. And I call this a tacit meaning because you don't have to be conscious when you raise your hand, say in class, that you are asking to be called on. You do it, and that's enough. You know that you're being tacitly, that you're asking to be called on without having to formulate a proposition in which you say to yourself, by raising my hand, I will be asking to be called on. That's just silly. The action is already meaningful in itself, apart from any proposition that we might formulate. So I think of this as the enaction of meaning. Meanings are enacted. They're not just thought of, they're enacted in practice. And here's an example to make it clearer. When you sit on a chair, you are doing something different from what happens when you put a pile of books on the chair. Why? Because sitting is a posture. It's a meaningful posture of the body, and the chair is a meaningful object for you when you sit on it. So the lived reality of sitting and the chair is significant for your act, whereas the pile of books, it has no way of living the meaning of the chair. It's just there. It's obstructed from falling to the floor by an obstacle, which is the seat of the chair. But that's a purely causal relation, unlike the relation of meaning involved in sitting. But of course, action, there's this correlation is very interesting, and we take advantage of it in our daily life all the time. But of course, action can fail. And so this then leads us to a second set of problems, the aspect of the conundrum of knowledge and action. Action has a contingency about it. It has a necessity in the sense in which I talked about necessity earlier, in that it feels right when it works, but it's also contingent. And this is a kind of paradoxical combination. So let me give another example to develop this relationship. Take the case of hunger and food. These are two concepts, two meanings that are bound together. There's a conceptual necessity about their relationship. It makes no sense to talk about hunger if you don't have a concept of food, and vice versa. On the other hand, their relationship is factually contingent. Just because hunger and food are conceptually necessary doesn't mean you're going to get dinner now. Each act relates, therefore, to a contingent object from a third-person standpoint, but the act enacts a necessary meaning from a first-person standpoint. So this is a puzzling relationship that we need to understand better. So I'm going to introduce the concept of potentiality here in order to talk about this relationship. This is a concept that's central to Marcuse's work, but here I'm going to develop it in a way, more phenomenologically developed way than he did. We'll come back to him in a moment, but first we need to see what potentiality means from the standpoint of the first person subject. I think of potentiality in this sense as an anticipation of necessity. There's a kind of teleology built into lived experience. Everything is for something. The chair is for sitting. This is from the first person standpoint, this is the necessity that binds it potentially to our act of sitting. And we generalize from this notion of potentiality to a universal teleology. We see nature, for example, as either flourishing or devastated. We think of health in terms of well-being and its opposite, sickness. And in each case, we ascribe an end, a purpose to the things that we encounter. This corresponds to an idea of growth, which is self-evident. We have grown, our children grow, the nature grows. The world is a place in which there is a direction to time, right? From beginnings to final necessary ends. And this idea of teleology, of potentiality, determines the organization of craft in pre-modern societies. Artifacts are made in function of an anticipation of acts by the subjects, of their needs, of their well-being. Now, Marcuse's argument starts with this notion of potentiality, which he sees as essential to understanding the world, but it is eliminated in natural science. And this poses problems for him that I'll explain now. Science and technology are necessarily neutral. Modern science and technology are necessarily neutral with respect to values. They don't posit ends. They don't concern themselves with the potentialities of the things that they study. We look at the flower and admire its beauty. Now it droops and dies. From the standpoint of botany, neither the flourishing of the flower nor its death are of particular interest. each one has its causal nature, which is worth studying. But of course, if you want to decorate your living room, it matters to you how the flower looks. You take on it a definite teleological perspective. Now, I don't think that although I think Marcuse was concerned about natural science, I don't think that there's a real problem here with science and technology, or at least science of not being teleological. But Marcuse argued that this non-teleological attitude, this this completely causal world in which science bathes, has been generalized in advanced industrial societies. The generalization of this scientific attitude into everyday experience, colonizing the life world, he calls one-dimensionality. The two dimensions of his thought are, of course, the facts and then the potentialities of the facts. But if you cut off the potentialities, you're left just with the facts. And this then becomes the form of an objectivistic culture, a culture in which meaning is stripped down to its flat, existence. If only factual existence is real, then potentialities can't guide technology as it creates a world of artifacts. Instead, we think of what in pre-modern societies would have been thought of as potentialities as subjective values. The potentialities have left from our life world experience and substituted for them are subjective values that we attribute to ourselves as a subject. So nothing now is necessary in the sense in which things are necessary in the life world, in Marcuse's view. Now, there's obviously an exaggeration here, because when we sit on a chair, we do the same thing they did in ancient Egypt. But what interests Marcuse is the emergence of a kind of generalized instrumental reason, a concern with pure ends that structures the social organization of a modern capitalist society. And the form in which the world is shaped by the institutions that regulate it, and the way we generally respond to those institutions, is confined to this one-dimensional perspective. And this has political implications. We live in a technified world. It's a designed world. In effect, you could say that design is a world choice. Technology and science structure this world that we live in, the life world. We live essentially in a second nature we have built. And science and technology form our culture to a great extent. The meanings are objectified in this built environment in a way that conforms to some extent, to the extent Marcuse will argue, to a considerable extent Marcuse will argue, in conformity with scientific view of the world. The result is that the social world is governed by values, and these values are necessarily those of the dominant power in society. And that's a capitalist power. Capitalism has imperatives that stem from the organization of the market and the problems of control of the labor force. And those imperatives guide the values that guide the capitalists in their construction of our technified world. Profit is the key, but Marcuse argues workers and communities have potentialities that are denied in the process because they don't make for profit, and they are in fact ignored by the system. And these potentialities are more or less occluded, and Marcuse writes in the 1960s, when before the New Left has changed his mind. It's a one-dimensional society in which people's needs and needs of communities are ignored, and people put up with it. They, in fact, like it. They are not able to understand what they've lost when they've lost the potentials that are denied by capitalism. So, I mean, he's obviously thinking of consumer society. People get what they get the goods. The goods are delivered, Marcuse says, by capitalism in the form of individual consumption. But many other aspects of life, which could be of importance to the individuals, are left out as the focus is entirely switched to private consumption. Well, there's a misfit then between the capitalist technical environment and the artifacts it creates and human life. And this misfit is in the nature of capitalism. It can do no other, according to Marcuse's Marxist argument. Now, up until fairly recently, industrialism was successful in suppressing protest over these problems. Both biased expertise and violence suppressed the needs of individuals and communities. But things changed in the 1960s and 70s, the late 60s and 70s. And Marcuse observed the change. There was a kind of breakthrough beyond one-dimensionality as the student movement, the various civil rights movements, the anti-war movement, and the environmental movement, and movements in medical care and urban design all began to emerge as as critics of the one-dimensional material world capitalism had created. Scientific concepts were picked up by ordinary individuals so they could understand what was happening. Take the case of air pollution. People needed the scientific concept of pollution in at least a basic stripped down form. They had to know that this was chemicals in the atmosphere and not devils. Once people got the hang of these basic concepts, they could then turn them back on the scientific technical community and argue in terms of a potential, in this case, health, for changes in the technified world. So out of this new constellation, which emerged in the late 60s, alienation reappears. Now, Marcuse, in his, I think in One-Dimensional Man, he questions whether alienation is even a concept anymore once people have stopped concerning themselves with what they've lost because they're so happy with their consumer goods. But now that concept is pertinent. You could think of capitalism as the contingent obstacle to the collective act that the community wants to perform. Alienation from a first-person standpoint would then be contingency under capitalism. So let's return now to the starting point, the relation between science and culture. The question that is posed by the argument so far is how potentialities can enter a technified world. That's the concrete political form in which science and culture relate today. And I have a proposal which is different from the ideas of Husserl, Nishida, and Marcuse, which I'm going to present you with in conclusion. They thought that the problem was to somehow incorporate science, in Husserl's case, into philosophy, to reestablish the validity of the life world in the face of a essentially nihilistic scientific universe. Marcuse had a similar idea. Science would have to be transformed by, in his case though, by socialism, which would make possible through the transformed experiences of people, including scientists, in a socialist society, would make possible the introduction of potentiality into the structure of science. And Nishida had the strange belief that somehow Japanese victory in the Pacific War would enable the spread of a world culture based on Japanese premises. Toward the end of the war, he gave up on this idea, but he still held on to the notion of a kind of Japanese cultural hegemony, world hegemony, that would place science in its rightful place in the culture. Now, I don't think any of these solutions work for us. They're implausible, and they overlook what is really the most significant change in the relation of science and culture in our time. And that is the various social movements that have protested against the inherited structure of our capitalist technical world, a world that was constructed in indifference, complete indifference to many of the most important needs of nature and human life. And the way these movements function is through translation. So I'm going to introduce here the concept of translation, which you may be familiar with from science and technology studies, but it has an earlier history. It's in fact even adumbrated in Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, although he doesn't have a way of developing it yet. But we can easily develop it now. We understand, as I said before, that the objects of science are constructions. They're meanings that emerge from the life world. They're life world contents refined by science. For example, measured more precisely, quantified, and so on. We know this actually without any doubt from our experience of medicine. Take the case of a blood test. You get a blood test and it reviews a dozen different parameters of your body. There are, in fact, tens of thousands, perhaps millions of chemicals floating in your blood, but the blood test doesn't test them. Why not? Because the object of medical science is not every chemical in your blood. It's just those that are pertinent, that relate to the constructed object of the medical body, which is an imaginative creation that is organized around a teleology, the concept of health. So we know this from our relation to medicine, that sciences can incorporate potentialities. Now, this has become politically relevant to a very large number of sciences, not just medicine, but we find that this is a constant problem as we attempt to modify and improve the inherited technology with its strong capitalist bias and bend it to humane purposes. And this is, of course, not true of physics and chemistry, the sciences that interested our philosophers, but rather the socially embedded sciences, the lesser sciences, like engineering or urban planning or food science, all these various sciences that actually shape the artifacts with which we live, that form the material aspect of the life world. And all these artifacts emerging from these socially embedded sciences are contested now. There's a life world, there's an interaction between the life world and these sciences. And this interaction consists in the translation of potentialities experienced in the life world into new scientific objects. So just as we saw in the case of medicine, these objects, whether it be the organization of urban transport or the engineering of a user interface for a computer, all these objects are constantly under reconstruction as they are modified by life world concerns, by potentialities that are vehiculated in the life world and inadequately realized in the artifacts produced by these sciences, these socially embedded sciences. So I think of this a little differently from, I mean, we tend to think of political struggle as winner takes all type operation, or perhaps a compromise in which some people get something, others get other things, and there's an outcome which is unsatisfactory to both. But we're not dealing with that here. What we're dealing with is a kind of lay expert conflictual dialogue. The potentialities are known to lay people because they live in the life world with all its complexity. The experts are operating from a very narrow field. The specific object that's evolved in their science in which they've been educated in. There's a potential conflict here because the experts may ignore aspects of the world that are important to the public, and they may be reminded of those aspects in this conflictual dialogue that they have to engage in now with their public. I call it conflictual because there are resistances. Experts, and of course behind the experts, often capitalist corporations, don't want to change their practices. There's, you'll remember that seatbelts were going to cost thousands of dollars before they were imposed on the automobile companies, and they were forced to install them for a mere, I don't remember the exact figure, $25, some minor sum, but the resistance was fierce. They didn't want to do it. And the same has been true with air pollution and with many other problems. And still today, you get companies telling you that things that scientists know are dangerous are actually perfectly okay for you. The atom is your friend, as they said in the 1950s, when they were trying to keep us from being scared by nuclear power. So there is a conflict here, but there's also a resolution, and it's not just a compromise. It's a serious restructuration of the expert field, but through changes in the object. So where, for example, the automobile engineer did not need to think about the atmosphere in 1950, by 2000, he's busy adding a chapter to his textbook on catalytic converters and transforming the car into an environmentally more sensitive object. This kind of change of translation between potentialities and the objects of science, which ultimately results in a changed technical environment, has reached its peak with the climate change movement, because this is ultimate. This is survival, and it is global. And we've seen quite a bit of resistance to the slow pace of change that is essentially organized around business problems, problems of depreciation, cost accounting, and so on. We've seen a push for much more vigorous action, and that push is likely to get stronger. Movements like the Extinction Rebellion or the school strike may just be the beginnings of something much larger that will have huge impacts on industry and on our world. So I'm going to conclude now. Nishida attempted to encompass science and culture. His society was colonized, in a sense, by modern science. It was a part of the imperial imposition that the Japanese resisted. Now that colonization, you could say, appears in the West itself. We now experience the scientifically generated, technified world in much the way that the Japanese experienced science and technology in the early 20th century. We experience it as an alienated world that we need to somehow modify. But here, unlike our philosophers, we today are moving toward practical change rather than a conceptual theory of the place of science and culture. This is a form of struggle which I believe will be coextensive with modernity going forward. It will be an essential feature of any modern society. Whether capitalism survives, whether it's replaced by socialism or some third thing we can't yet imagine, these problems of the relation of science to culture will persist and will require public action. This will become a significant part of what we understand by democracy in the future. So that's the end of the talk. I want to show you some things here before I leave, or before anyway I take questions and hear from Yuk. I've put here my web address where there are a number of articles that, and even some books that might interest you. I think actually there is one book in Chinese in the section on translations. And I have a YouTube channel where you can find other talks like this one. And here are some books. The Marcuse book does not yet have a cover, so I've just printed the title. Then there's Technosystem, which is my most recent book on technology, and a little book on Japanese thought, which is also available, which I wrote recently. And now, to conclude, since I know there are many people in China in the audience, I want to show you the books that I've written that have been translated into Chinese, which I hope you can find, if you're curious, through their publishers. I think the first one on my left, I think is the one which is available on my webpage. Okay, so I've finished, and it's time now for the next phase of this conversation.
Right, so thank you very much, Andrew, for this wonderful talk, very informational, and you also touched on many questions. So, you know, as etiquette of the dialogue, I always confront my invitees, so there is no exception. But let me try to first of all to formulate what you have said regarding Verso. Or maybe Heidegger, even you didn't mention Heidegger, but I think Heidegger is at the background, and Nishida and Marcuse. But we can also, you know, and try, well, from my perspective, I try to understand Verso, Heidegger, Nishida, the response as a way to challenge the domination of modern science, which for them, you know, very much associated to a form of a technization. That, for example, we find in Verso, especially the late Verso, and I think because only in the late Verso that the Lebenswelt and cultural object have an important place. The 1936 crisis of European science, and then a bit later the 1939 experience of and judgments. And these two books I worked a lot many years ago when I was writing my PhD thesis. And maybe we can say that Verso was trying to return science or technology to cognition, to the question of experience, because he wanted to reground or to give a new ground for science through phenomenology. So maybe we can, you know, say that he tried to ask what might be, or what is what is the possibility of predication? Like giving a predicate to a thing, and what would be such a possibility? And I think in Heidegger kind of, but however, you know, Husserl's thesis on crisis of European science was later deconstructed by Derrida, especially on the original geometry, where Derrida shows that technology is fundamental to such experience. So basically, you know, this is taking kind of deconstruct Husserl's critique of modern science and technology in the way. And in Heidegger, maybe we can say that we find another proposition regarding predication. For me, Heidegger's question was rather about the impossibility of predication. That's to say, the question of being. Now, because Heidegger always pick up this phrase from Kant, when Kant says that being is not a real predicate. So the impossibility of predication that we found in Heidegger, and this impossibility as the possibility of science and modern science and technology, that's to say, a return to the question of being, a return to the question of the historical world. Again, this is deconstructed by Stigler, who has been our good friend, who shows that, you know, Heidegger's, there is an ignorance of the question, not really ignorance, but there is a kind of undermining of the question of technology in his question of being. So kind of deconstruction basically also distract such a response. Or even in Nishida, for me, it's again the question of predication, but taken in a different way. As we know that the late Nishida developed what he called the logic of Basho, and that is a logic of predication. But it's not like what Husserl trying to say. If we say the rose is red, I must explain how could this predication, being red of the rose, take place. But for Heidegger, you know, the rose is red. There is something very, you know, there's something outside. There's something extraordinary in, you know, like when he talked about it's something close to mysticism. When he says, you know, the rose is just red. There's no reason. There's no way to explain. But in Nishida, there's a different way of predication, meaning that the being red, the rose is actually predicate. Rose is a predicate of being red. So basically, the subject is reversed as a predicate. So for, you know, in Aristotelian logic, you know, just to explain for the audience, rose is red, red is the predicate, but for Nishida, it's the other way around. We place the rose in a predicate, in red, in being red. So Nishida reversed the question of predication to the question of place, of Basho. And then there is a huge question, and I think you mentioned about that, even though implicitly, that by performing this logic of placements, finally we end up in what he called the true Basho, the true place of nothingness. Because he didn't want to enter into Buddhism, but that's where he ended up. Now, there is a problem of nihilism at play there, but then he tried to say that, look, you know, it is not a nihilistic place, but rather it is a social historical world. The true place of nothingness is the social historical world of Japan. Now, again, you know, this, again, we can, you know, we find it in Nishitani, and we can also deconstruct the whole setting theory of Nishida with Derrida and with Stigler, because a social historical world is a world of technology, of symbolic world. So the kind of the three thinkers that you invoke, from a phenomenological perspective, Nishida, I also consider him as a very phenomenological. That seems to have failed to respond to the question, especially in Nishida and Nishitani. I try to show in two of my books how the question of technology was undermined in their discourse on the question of nothingness. So basically, as you said, that these solutions are no longer sufficient, and that we have to call for a new solution to the question of technology. Then you invoke Marcuse, but for me, it sounds more like Marcuse's Heideggerian Marxist humanism, in the way that when we think about the question of potentiality, the question of emancipation, and the possibility of science and technology in the socialist society. Now, to the end, you invoke something, you propose your own idea, your own suggestions of what is society, what could the future look like. Now, I wanted to also enter into this discussion by asking if this is not too much optimist or even simple response to the question, the problem that we have today. The reason is the following. Today we have, as you said, we have more interactions with science and technology, especially regarding the development of technology. But on the other hand, we see that there are certain kind of solutionist proposals towards in terms of giving remedy to the toxicity of the society. For example, let's say transhumanism, who believe that by using technology, we are going to resolve all the problems that is produced by technology. If we are able to take that into consideration, or even we have eco-modernism. Believe that if we push forward modern technology, we are going to build a better world, because we are going to repair the earth that we destroyed with better technology. Like eco-modernism featured people like Stewart Brand, and on their website, I just I can't on their websites they feature Hong Kong as one example, how we destroy, how we transform the mountains and turn it into a livable place. So we have eco-modernism, but are these are these really the solution that we should look forward? That indeed there are more. As you say, there was more kind of design orientation in their way of doing, but also we know that the transhumanist ideology is basically another phase of techno-capitalism, and which you also mentioned about in your book. The second thing is that true, we are producing scientists, we are producing engineers every day, in our universities today. And this remains a really big problem for me, a big problem of pedagogy today, is that we are producing all these talents for the industry. But once they enter into the industry, they are producing more and more toxic technologies that convert us into pure consumerism or even to herd. Because of the problem of our education, that we still based on a very highly disciplined a form of teaching and learning. For example, one of the major philosophers of technology, you are teaching in the School of Communication, not in the Department of Philosophy, because there are not many places which can accommodate us who are philosophers working on technology and who wanted to work on technology and philosophy and art and so on. So basically the industry, the university are producing more and more talents who basically enter the industry and make the situation, didn't really improve the situation. And in the past 2 years, when in Hong Kong every day when I walk to the university, I always has to be very careful because I try not to head-on question students who are on their mobile phones while they are walking on the street. You know, everyone is looking at their mobile phone and not looking at people passing by, and I have to be very attention to pay attention to that. These examples just to say our technologies are producing more and more additions, and these are made possible by our graduates who are educated in the university. So I'm for myself, I'm probably saying that I'm a bit more conservative with this. I'm not pessimist, I'm not optimist, but I just think that this is a big problem that we have to deal with today. So I'm also very curious what you think about this. And lastly, concerning there was one point that you talk in some other places, but we didn't talk today, and I think this is very important, is Marcuse's longing for a new science and technology, for a new idea of science and technology. For me, because the critique of technology as an ideology from Marcuse, from Habermas, in the field where maybe I said in the school where I used to study, for example, with especially the French thinkers, they basically ignore this question. They said Habermas, Marcuse are irrelevant for the question of technology. But for me, I think this is still a very important question. That I don't think Marcuse and Habermas are irrelevant concerning the critique of technology. But it seems to me very urgent to ask what might be the alternative science and technology today, and that that would also challenge a certain optimist idea of that we are having more engagement with science and technology. But the most difficult question, as you also point out in many places, what could this new science and technology look like? And what might be the condition under which we can create such a possibility? So I'm I'll be very curious to hear what you might say.
Okay, I can say something in response. Well, first of all, about philosophy. It is a branch of the humanities which in the Anglo-Saxon countries became completely colonized by an imagination of science, not science itself. And in Europe, it's literary. So between the people who think they know something about science and are operating out of that naturalistic logic, and the literary scholars in Europe, there's no space for technology. But all these people are busy turning the key in the ignition, using their electric toothbrush, answering messages on their phone and on their iPhone. I mean, it's a kind of absurdity, that people are completely embedded in this second nature technified world, but they don't want to talk about it, even though their profession is supposed to be about reflecting on the world. So, I mean, we can't change this. I managed to find in a communication department people who were more interested. Well, there were some resistances there too. It's hard in the academic world to get a lowly object like technology into the picture. There's in Plato's Parmenides, the young Socrates is being interviewed by the old Parmenides. Of course, Parmenides died before Socrates was born, but this was Plato's fantasy. And at one point, Parmenides asks Socrates if there are forms, ideal forms of abject things like dirt And Socrates says no, and Parmenides tells him, you haven't understood. There are no abject things. Technology is not a lower thing that you can ignore because it's not the shit of the universe. But if you look in the academic world, you'd think it was. And that's a huge failure. And part of that failure is the production of technicians and scientists who have become essentially technicians, whose education has ignored everything except the specialized discipline in which they are expected to function. So they're unable to actually function as intellectuals with a broader view of the world and concerns about the relation of their activity to the human beings who they are supposedly serving. So that's a dismaying aspect of our current situation, which I agree with you completely, Yuk, is not easy to. It's not easy to think about. Now, as for the other part of your question, I mean, I think that it's very hard for people to see as astonishing something that's obvious. But often obvious things are astonishing, and you need a historical perspective to realize just how astonishing they are. So, I mean, there are women professors. And that's completely ordinary. Nobody thinks that's astonishing. But I'm old enough to have gone to universities where, for example, the only woman professor was a Nobel Prize winner. There were no others. I mean, she was the only one qualified. So you have to take a historical perspective on the relation of the public to science and technology. And then you see that there was no relation until quite recently. And we are living in an unusual time. Something new has happened. Public concern with science and technology, at least since the beginnings of the industrial era, has been minimal, and now it is central. And that's an astonishing fact. And I think it's underestimated. I think, for example, some philosophers like Bernard Stiegler did not underestimate this fact. He knew this was the most important fact that you had to deal with if you wanted to have a social theory. But for the most part, people ignore it or think that it's just, that's just the way things are. It's fairly minor. I mean, compared to the war in Ukraine, what's a little school strike over climate change? And yet, this is the reality, right? That without that school strike, without further pressure of that sort, the human race is pretty much doomed. So these are the key questions, and the answer to the question of how science and technology must be changed, modified in the future, must lie in these struggles. Now, Marcuse's argument was that once a socialist society existed, the changed experience of the scientists would inspire them to introduce new concepts, new ideas into the object of their research. And he imagined that somehow this would incorporate value into science. I find this quite implausible. Science is a craft. It's just another craft. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's ways of doing things. And of course, new ways are coming up all the time, and people have to learn them and so on. But there's no real breakthrough into some other way of doing the craft. I mean, you're making shoes, maybe you now have new designs, or you can interest people in shoes made of plastic or whatever. It doesn't matter. You're still a shoemaker, and you still have to deal with the fact that feet are feet. And science is like that. There's a lot of talk about how it's all going to be changed by some new formulation of science. And this is not even, as Marcuse suggested, after socialism, but right now under capitalism. It's all happening with quantum mechanics or who knows what. But I don't believe any of that. I think, and I think I have a sense of science from growing up in the middle of the scientific community. I spent my entire childhood hanging out with cyclotrons and nuclear power plants. It's just not the sort of thing that philosophers imagine. And so it's not going to change because some new theory will tell us, for example, that human beings and nature are one thing. It's not like that's some discovery, but a lot of ink is spread over this idea that we have now reached a new stage in human existence where we now know that human beings are part of nature. I don't think that's an interesting proposition. It's what we need is not human beings being theoretically part of nature, but human beings practically changing the second nature that we're building with our science and technology. And that's happening in a small way. It's happening significantly and will happen further in the future. And I see that as a much more plausible solution to the problem Marcuse posed than the notion that somehow in a future socialist society, the experience of scientists would itself inspire new ideas, new theories, which would incorporate human values, or the contemporary theories that we hear so much about that say that it's already happening because we have new theories, which again, I just don't find plausible. The real scene of the action is politics, practical movements to change the objects of science. And that's where it's really happening. And that's why we need these concepts from phenomenology, like the life world, and concepts from Hegel, like potentiality, because these are the concepts that enable us to understand the philosophical significance, the ultimate significance of these social movements. So that's my reply. And I'm sure you have something to say about that.
I just want to follow up with the question of science. With the last point that you made. Well, of course, I think that this is from a historical perspective, it's very important to understand also Heidegger, Marcuse, and Nishida, and so on. Very important for us to learn, what were the responses about overcoming modernity, and what from the philosophical perspective. And
let me say, I don't deny that. I think on the contrary, their concepts are the ones we need to now develop and modify for this new situation.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. And by knowing what didn't work out the best, and then we can formulate what would be the next step. But regarding the question of science, because for me the question of science is not about like shoe making or so on, but science, the fundamental question of science, of course, is epistemology. How to know. How do you know about the reality? How about know the world? And epistemology is really something I think that philosophers and scientists could all engage and to challenge a certain kind of stereotype or even hegemony. I mean, let's say in the 1930s, there was also debates between Marxist biology and capitalist biology.
Right.
So we have a Marxist biology, people like Joseph Needham, who are trying to integrate the Chinese philosophy and organicism and trying to propose a different way of understanding the ecosystem, understand the relation between organisms and other organisms. And this debate, of course, continued for example, in the USA with the writing of Gould and others, Stephen Gould and others, who trying to position the kind of Marxist biology to understand where are reform and how did we come here. So I think all these are very important interventions that could be made, even from both from a scientific perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective, and I'm talking about the question of epistemology, because then it also related us to the question of culture that you try to invoke regarding Nishida, for example. That of course in Japanese history, or in Japanese culture before modernization, let's say before the second half of the 19th century, there were also techniques, there were also ways of making, ways of knowing, and what are their places today in this modernized world? Are they completely obsolescent, or they still have a certain contribution, or even can pose challenge to the epistemological hegemony that we are witnessing today? And their different form of life, the different way of the different way of relating one to the other species, the human species to other species. Well, let's say the question of coexistence. So are there not also many resources we can draw from the perspective of culture, from cultures, I should say plural, and histories that allow us to challenge all these the actual situation that we are in. So for me, this is another reason of reading Nishida. There's another reason of trying to understand, even though I like you, I think that the way they, there is a close relation between this insistence on nothingness and the question of war, but at the same time, I feel there are many things that different cultures could offer today to think about science and technological development. And maybe this is my own resonance with what Habermas and Marcuse would say: a new science, a new technology, or maybe we can say new technologies or new sciences in their plurality. But that would be my response to your question, to your answer regarding the possibility of science and technology.
I just add that I do agree. All different cultures have some things to offer, but what we shouldn't overlook the fact that our own culture has a kind of indigenous culture too. Now that we have broken through the barrier of one-dimensionality to some extent, we begin to generate also our own contributions to the changing of to these epistemic issues that you raise. So I think it's certainly the case that there are features of Japanese culture which Nishida valued and which are still significant for our understanding of the world and even for modern science and technology. I mean, consider miniaturization, the technical role of miniaturization, which the Japanese are busy doing in the Middle Ages. They took the Chinese fan, which was a flat fan, and turned it into a folding fan so they could put it in their kimono. So miniaturization, bonsai, it's part of the culture, and it has now turned up in electronics as a key feature of modern technology. So, and then of course there are ideas of respect for nature that are central to many indigenous cultures, which we're only beginning to be able to think about now, and with the help of ecology. So I agree with what you're saying, but I just think we shouldn't undervalue our own contribution, because we are concerned about nature, about health, about all kinds of things that have been ignored by several centuries of capitalist industrialism. And we have to bring those things to the attention of science and technology.
Right. Thanks. It's interesting you mentioned about miniature. Actually, I have a PhD student working on a thesis on bonsai and nanotechnology. On this, so it's really interesting to hear that from what you have said. So, yeah, well, of course we should not ignore what is happening in Europe, in the USA, all the movements. I mean, a thesis that Bruno Latour has already raised many years. We have never been modern to see this different the space left in European modernity that could have a certain agency in today's techno-scientific world. So of course, I think this is also very important as well to see what the Western culture can transform itself through these attempts. So great, thank you. We have a bit of time, so I wanted to leave to the audience if they have any questions for you. And I think there is a question. Maybe I can try to read. I tried to read this question from the chat box from Zhen Lejie. I don't. So there are two questions. First one, what do you think about contradictory technologies and sciences, such as nuclear science, which can produce green energy on the one hand and can be devastating on the other? How do you see this relation between this type of technology and politics, especially in the current unstable global context? And how should we alert to the impacts of this controversial modern technology and culture and society when it becomes a medium and resource for political power struggle? So the question of pharmacon, the question of Plato's pharmacon. Second question, how do you see...
Maybe I should answer them one at a time.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't forget.
Right, okay.
The nuclear power question, I'm afraid it's not quite the pharmacon that the questioner may have hoped, because the nuclear power is also bad. It's not just nuclear weapons that are dangerous, it's also nuclear power. At least that's my view. Because we don't know what to do with the waste products, and they'll be radioactive and dangerous for thousands of years, much longer than any time span we could hope to plan for. So I'm afraid that we will have to use the sun, because we can't use the nucleus to get us out of our energy problems. So I think there was another aspect to that question which I'm overlooking. What was it? The second part.
The second part is that how should we be alert to the impacts of this controversial modern technology on culture and society when it becomes a medium and resource for political power struggles? Yes.
Right. So, of course, mastery of technology is central to political power in the modern world. That's not going to change. And I don't think that, I believe that we are necessarily modern now. There is no way back. We are modern people, and therefore we live in a technified world, and this is not going to change. The question is, can we actually survive in this technified world, or will it destroy us? I think it's pretty clear that democracy is the only hope for making sense of this world. That doesn't mean that it will make sense of it. We see plenty of evidence that people are incapable of understanding their own interests and managing a democratic society in a rational way and a humane way. There's plenty of evidence that people are just not competent to do this. And maybe the species will die because we now have the means to destroy ourselves, which wasn't the case before, when bad rulers could devastate a province, but not a planet. However, to the extent that there is any hope, it must lie in people rationally understanding their own interests and imposing on the people who master the technology concern for their interests. And I guess I have some hope that that's possible, but you know, things haven't been looking good lately, so I'm less optimistic than I used to be. So you had a second question?
The second question is, how do you see, well, that's an old question, as old as the beginning of philosophy. How do you see the conflict between theory, theoretical knowledge, and practical knowledge?
That is a big question. I've been very strongly influenced by a certain book, called History and Class Consciousness, written by Lukács in the 1920s. So I think of theory and practice as somehow mutually implicated. Theory and practice are not separate domains, and practice is not simply an implementation of theory. Meaning takes a different form in theory and in practice, but it is present in both, and their interaction is critical. But this would take us, if we continued, in a very different direction from the talk. We would then be concerned about Marxist theory and its history. In the talk, I did want to make the argument that practice in the form of political struggle over the life world consequences of technology can influence theory in the form of scientific objects. So that there's a reciprocity there, which I think is essential. And it goes both ways, because the practice would make no sense to people if they had not absorbed enough of the scientific theory to be able to give a meaning to the objects of their action.
I just want to resonate with what you said, Andrew. Because when you talk about the future, I always make this metaphor, or take this metaphor from Gregory Bateson about alcoholics. You know, he said, and I think we moderns, we are alcoholic. You know, this economic expansion, military expansion will continue. But Bateson says that, you know, for alcoholic, when the alcoholic will quit his habits, there are two possibilities. Well, there is one possibility, is that the alcoholic will hit bottom, which means two cases. One, the alcoholic develops a fatal disease, like cancer. Or the alcoholic has a serious traffic accident, you know, crash a car and almost die, end up in the hospital. That is the only possibility. But that one of the few possibility that the alcoholic will be able to stop its behavior. But how, you know, our question is that, you know, how could the alcoholic take a different direction before end up in the hospital? And this is a very difficult question. And extremely important question, how could we avoid coming to that stage that described by many science fictions and movies today. And during the war between Russia and Ukraine, I went back to Kant's Perpetual Peace again. And Kant said something very interesting at the very beginning. He said that politicians used to underestimate philosophers, thinking that what they say is purely academic. And then he says, if what I said is anything against the will of and the agenda of the ruler, please don't persecute me because you think I'm not serious anyway. So why do you like to persecute me? So Kant was very intelligent that he basically defend himself for his descendant behavior. But what is the most important, and I think that is still very relevant to what you said regarding democracy, is the public use of reason. How could reason be public still today? And that may be the one possibility that we stop or we change the direction before we hit bottom, as what Basin described. We have another question. I have a question around how phenomenology can be used to understand digital identities. Is there a potential for greater emancipation through an individual's creation and manifestation for themselves, or is this manifestation inherently flawed because it is mediated through the capitalist apparatus in the device used for this identity creation, the network which brings the internet? Well, I think that you addressed this question in one of your articles on social network.
Yes. Yeah, I've written about this. This is an important question. I'm not sure that phenomenology is the best approach to this question, because it really is about social and political power and how it affects technology. We started out with the internet in the 1980s with a system that enabled people to communicate on a public network. And there were other public networks that were available that operated just as common carriers. That's like the telephone network that you could use if you didn't have access to the internet. And on these networks, people engaged in interesting ways. They used text to communicate because we couldn't use video. It was too, we didn't have the speed. And people did classes and business meetings and hobbyist groups and people with illnesses. And there was a huge proliferation of interactive conferences on the internet. And then this was taken over by a few big companies, which turned it into something very different. And now we see the result. So the question really, the result is ugly. It's like there's no beautiful thing that can't be made ugly by government and business. You can take the beauties of nuclear physics and turn it into an atom bomb. You can take the beauties of the early internet and turn it into Facebook. So this uglification that emerges from power needs to be fought, and fighting it in the case of the internet may involve radical technical change, because it seems very difficult to regulate and control these companies. That may be a part of it, but there may also be a return to peer-to-peer networks using new technologies that are being developed by people by computer scientists who are themselves, like the physicists in the old days, furious that their beautiful idea has been turned into shit. So the physicists couldn't do much because the government controlled all the weapons. But in this case, it's quite possible that the computer scientists can meet a public demand for a different way of communicating that is not as toxic as the way in which the companies have made it.
Right, thanks. Well, our friend Harry Halpin, if you remember him, he has been working on this since years, and now he has a big company. So we have two last questions. So maybe we can try to answer these two questions before we end. So from Alvin Satyabudi, first question, how to cope with digital capitalism? For example, Susanna Zumbor's surveillance capitalism, related to democratization technology, where is trying to apply constructivism critical theory. First question, critical theory and surveillance capitalism. Second point, technocrat trying to form hegemony with advanced technology such as blockchain. How or what would be the position of critical theory to resist it?
Well, what we can use critical theory for in a case like this is trying to understand better what's going on with these technologies. I mean, what I just said is an example. We need to think about the potentials of the technologies that are not being exploited or that are being destroyed by the development of these networks. There is quite a bit of research on these questions, for example, on algorithms and the use of algorithms in order to steer conversations toward violent extremes. Now, when we started out with online communication, there were no algorithms. You communicated with the people who you knew and who you could get in touch with. This is quite different from a system that tries to organize and mediate communication in order to produce an effect of some sort. In the case of Facebook, the effect is money. And money is produced by time spent online, and time spent online is increased when people are angry. And therefore, you get the picture. You can see how designing an algorithm to can turn out to be a monstrous intervention into human communication. So critical theory gives us resources for taking a critical look at these systems and trying to figure out how to reconfigure them so that they again perform the functions that we value, and not just the function of making money for Mark Zuckerberg. So I'm not sure what the second part of that question was, but
I think the second part of the question is technocrats trying to form hegemony with advanced technology such as blockchain.
Yeah, blockchain is a good example. Blockchain, you know, some technologies are very specific, like a butter knife is for cutting butter. It's not useful for many other things. But other technologies, like the gear, have thousands of possible uses, millions of possible uses. So blockchain is more like a gear than a butter knife. It could be used for many different things. Now, our friend Harry Halpin has an idea what it can be used for in order to create a peer-to-peer or something similar to a peer-to-peer type network, which would not be controlled by a business that would not therefore have the power to impose its imperatives on human communication. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who want to use blockchain for to make money. In fact, to use it as money. And it can also, no doubt, there are all sorts of things I haven't even heard of that it can do that will make people rich and have perhaps in the process, not necessarily, but possibly bad consequences. So I can't really say much about this, you know. It's just think about blockchain not as one thing, but as the potential for many different things with very different relations to our values. Oh, Harry is there.
Someone was asking if we can give the name of Harry Halpin. I typed in the wrong place. I'm going to, so I typed the name to everyone. So Harry is a great friend, and he has been he's a philosopher, computer scientist, and he has been working on on crypto technology in Switzerland. She has a company working on crypto technology, working for the Tor project that allows encryption tools to serve online and so on. So it's a very good example to see how computer scientists also have, you know, they really, where some of the computer scientists are working on different paths from, you know, what we call surveillance society and so on. But of course, these are very big questions, surveillance society, to discuss. So I want to thank you, Andrew, very much for this talk and for the conversation. Of such a great pleasure. And I also wanted to thank everyone who stayed with us. We have more than 100 people today in the early morning. So thank you, everyone. And I don't know if you have any words to say to conclude, Andrew.
Well, not really. I hope that some people will look up my my YouTube channel, and where I'll put this talk when it's available. And I'm looking for more interaction with people. So, you know, you can find me online. I have an email, and it's on my webpage, and I'm on Facebook. Despite all the problems with Facebook, I can use it, but carefully.
Right.
So
yeah.
I hope there's that something comes from this that we can continue to discuss.
Yeah. So please subscribe Andrew's YouTube channel, and also for the, you know, for the Chinese audience, you know, maybe you also wanted to put some of these videos on Bilibili, which is Chinese YouTube, but it's has more audience. So that also can let more people know about your work. So great. So thank you again, and thanks everyone. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.